Hopefully folks are starting to trickle in. I'm just checking on a couple extra things to make sure that folks can join us this evening. So thank you for your patience. Perfect. That's there. Well, as folks get settled here, I would love to welcome you this evening to the Country Bookshelf's conversation with the folks from Torrey House Press and Betsy Gaines Quammen and Jacqueline Keeler to share their books, Jacqueline's new book, Standoff, and of course, Country Bookshelf favorite, Betsy's American Zion. I'm just going to give you a brief rundown here about how things are going to go. We are going to be able to take questions from folks. You can just click the Q&A button down at the bottom of your screen, or you can leave them in the chat. Also keep your eye on that chat because we will be dropping links to purchase the books in there. So if you didn't purchase your book with your registration and you haven't snagged them up yet, please do so. You're not going to want to miss them. And if you have any questions for our panelists this evening, don't be afraid to leave those in the chat or in the Q&A. And then once they have finished their conversation, I'll pop back on to help us field some of those questions. I do want to remind everyone that this is a shared creative space that we want to remain safe for everyone that's joined us for this evening. So offensive or inappropriate comments will see these are dismissed. And without further ado, I think I'm going to turn it over to you, Kirsten.
Well, great. Thank you, Jessica. Thank you, Country Bookshelf. Thank you, Bozeman. It's always a pleasure to do a Torrey House Press event with an independent bookstore. I am Kirsten Johanna Allen. I am publisher and executive director of Torrey House Press. We are the only nonprofit literary book publisher in the Intermountain West, and it has been my distinct honor to work with Jacqueline Keeler and Betsy Gaines Quammen to publish their books. Jackie's Standoff released just this month, and Betsy's American Zion came out last March, an auspicious time for a pub date. Folks, please do consider buying both of these books from Country Bookshelf, or if you're joining us from someplace far afield, you can visit your own independent bookseller. But you know, the folks at Country Bookshelf will put these books in the mail to you and you'll have them lickety split. I have been able to work with both Betsy and Jacqueline for quite a long time, and it is just such a joy to have their books finally out together, because I think they really speak to each other about some of these issues in the West around sovereignty, around public lands, around sacred lands, and our democracy even. So I've got some questions, Betsy and Jacqueline, and all of you who are joining us, pop in with any of your questions, so we'll be getting right to them. Wanted to start with this idea of sacred lands and how the idea of sacred lands fits into some of your work. Jacqueline, your book, Standoff, Standing Rock, the Bundy Movement, and the American Story of Sacred Lands, of course, features both the Standing Rock Sioux fight against the pipeline at the end of 2016 and the Malheur standoff that occurred in Malheur, Oregon, where the Bundy family held off people, the federal government. And Betsy, your book, American Zion, Clive and Bundy, God and Public Lands in the West, really looks at the Bundy movement, some of the early underpinnings of the Bundy movement in the West, and how those are tied in with land and literature and religion. And kind of an area of focus in your book is the Bunkerville area of Nevada. I wanted to start with you, Jacqueline. about this idea of sacred land and how that fits into the fight, the struggle at Standing Rock, and why you wanted to tell more about that story. And then we'll talk to Betsy about a different view of sacred lands in Bunkerville.
Yeah, I think that yeah, so I started this really started with 2016. I began January 2016 covering the Malheur Wildlife Refuge takeover. Um, I live here in Oregon, and it happened. Well, it wasn't in my backyard. It's 5 hours from Portland to drive down to that part of Oregon. Um, it's a huge county, Harney County. It's about the size of New Jersey, and has a population of about 7,000 people. And they have a saying there that there are more cattle than people in Harney County. And so we woke up to the news, and I had actually written about the Bundys before in 2014 for The Nation magazine, and there I took on Cliven Bundy's claims that to his ancestral rights there in Nevada, and contrasted his movement and his sort of armed sort of standoff with the coming together of the represented by the Cowboy and Indian Coalition in their fight against the Keystone XL pipeline in South Dakota and Nebraska. And I've been covering that. I attended some of the Public Utility Commission meetings there in South Dakota, and they had just organized a protest in front of the White House on Earth Day of that 2014. So I contrasted the way in which fighting the pipeline had brought these two really disparate groups together: the tribes and the white landowners, right? And so it was that was sort of that was my coverage of the Bundys. And if you read my article in The Nation, I sort of end it with the question like, can the land make us one people? Right? Is it possible, with this unity of the Cowboy and Indian Coalition versus, the divisiveness of the Bundy's perspective, Cliven Bundy's perspective, and his, and actually there's a chapter in Standoff where it's titled that, and it was actually recently excerpted by the Oregon Humanities magazine, and I think this is the question that we have to this day. I mean, today we just had the vote. The Republicans voted to basically boot Liz Cheney from her leadership position in the party and in Congress. She was like the third, I think, highest ranking Republican in Congress. And because she would not toe the line and support the idea that the election had been stolen at Trump's um, lies about the election. And so it shows that this is still a very real issue. And then I ended 2016, getting back to my journalism, in Standing Rock in December. I started in January in the snow with white men with guns. I ended in December with my own people. My great grandmother was raised there at Wakpala in Standing Rock. Her parents work there, and they were Yankton, Ihanktawan, Dakota, but we have relatives up at Standing Rock as well. So all these different Dakota and Lakota reservations, we're all related to each other. We're one. We are the Great Sioux Nation, the Ocheti Shakon One Nation, and so. But yeah, so I had to contrast the two because, of course, the two, had really different outcomes, different ways in which they were regarded particularly by the police, right? You see this sort of camaraderie, this sort of Western manliness in the meeting between, the sheriff in Harney County and Ammon Bundy. You can still see that YouTube video up. The Oregonian has it up on YouTube, and versus how Sheriff Kirchmeier in Morton County, North Dakota, interacted with the chairman of the Standing Rock Sioux tribe pretty early on in the conflict, in early August of 2016. The chairman of the tribe and some council members and the local physician, they were all arrested for doing a peaceful demonstration about the building of the pipeline, and by the sheriff, and they were strip searched. And normally, you know, uh, uh, heads of state, which the chairman is, I mean, the Standing Rock Sioux tribe is a nation, and they don't get strip searched by the local sheriff. They have some kind of diplomatic immunity. And so I think this shows the much more aggressive tactics. And by the end of, we spent Thanksgiving, I mean, we watched, them do a full out assault using less than lethal tactics. But, many of them learned in Afghanistan on the peaceful protest, legally based in treaty, in the treaty ratified by the U.S. Senate, that with the Great Sioux Nation, we just saw, and I often like to say that we actually saw the military nature of the occupation of our homelands, right? That area was in a treaty with the U.S. government. We were promised that area north of the Standing Rock Sioux Tribes Reservation was all supposed to be part of the Great Sioux Nation, and instead it's been illegally under international law. Treaties are international law, as well as the highest law of the land under the Constitution of the United States. They, these counties were created and they operate as out of, they are illegal under international law. And so you have the head of the law enforcement head of an illegal, government attacking an elected leader of the Great Sioux Nation.
Wow. Yeah, that was quite a year, and it was really something to see that all play out in that place. And that was one of the first times I really thought about this idea of whose land, who gets to consider something sacred. And boy, those memories are still really vivid for me, just as a bystander. Yeah. Betsy, the standoff in Bunkerville preceded the Bundy's takeover at Malheur by a few years, and it still has some of these same ideas of sacred lands. Who gets to decide what's sacred and what's theirs? What has some of your work illuminated for you about the idea of sacred land with the Bundys and their standoff in Bunkerville?
Yeah, I was working on my dissertation when I heard about the Bundys and what they call the Battle of Bunkerville, which was the standoff between law enforcement and the Bundys, which they're a ranching family in Clark County, Nevada, who had spent, I think by the time that the BLM began to confiscate their cows, they had not been paying grazing fees for 21 years. And this had gone through the courts at least twice. And finally, the courts ordered the cows to be confiscated. And I was doing my dissertation on Mormon cultural perspectives in landscape, and had looked at Mormon settlement. And actually, as I was working on this, I went and visited the Bundys a year before the Malheur wildlife takeover. And while I was working on my dissertation, I was reading Jacqueline Keeler's journalism. I was reading her stories so that I was able to understand the perspective of the Northern Paiute, the Burns tribe, that were very involved in terms of their response to the takeover in Oregon and these issues of land sovereignty and whose land it was. And Jackie can speak more to this, but the Northern Paiute had been engaged in traditional uses of the land at that point and were involved in these collaborative efforts. And so when I began to consider why land use battles were particularly vitriolic in regards to Sagebrush Rebellion and the Wise Use Movement, and then the Battle of Bunkerville, there was a layer of Mormon worldview that played into the Bundys' position. And there are any number of issues that they use to validate their campaign. If you read about the Battle of Bunkerville, one of the things that Cliven says is God was there with us. That's why no one was killed that day, because it was extremely close. I mean, guns were drawn on both sides, law enforcement and militia that showed up to stand in solidarity with the Bundys. And he talks about God being there. I think that the campaign gained a great deal of momentum at that point because the feds did back down, the BLM did back down, they didn't confiscate the cows. But there is a notion in American Zion, the title comes from this idea of Zion, meaning sacred Mormon homeland. This was a concept that Joseph Smith promised the Mormon people right around, I think it was the first time he promised the Mormon people sacred homeland was in 1831, which was a year after the publication of the Book of Mormon. And that Zion was supposed to be in Missouri. It didn't happen there because the Mormons were run out of Missouri by people who didn't like their abolitionist position at that point. They moved to Illinois, and at that point, because of a variety of circumstances that I write about in American Zion, Joseph Smith was assassinated, and Brigham Young and the Mormon people took the idea of Mormon homeland to the Great Basin. And so I think that there's a proprietary notion that's very much a part of the position that the Bundys have taken in terms of public land rebellion. I also think that there's this idea of theo-constitutionalism, this idea that the Constitution's sacred. There's also a belief in more fundamentalist circles of Mormon culture that Mormon people will be the ones who protect the United States from bad players who are abusing the Constitution. And then again, Jacqueline can speak to this, but the sense of history that the Bundys have go back to Mormon settlement. They don't consider the day before Mormon settlement, which was Southern Paiute in the case of Southern Utah Southern Nevada, where the Bundys now live. So when I read Jackie's book, I really thought about notions of sacred homeland and how these impact the way that these campaigns have unfolded. But to speak again to what Jackie said, the response of law enforcement to the white people has been very different to indigenous people in their campaigns.
For sure. Jackie, I want to go back to something that you have talked about before in this with occupation. You had indicated that at Standing Rock, with all of the militarized equipment that we saw that the county sheriff deployed against water protectors, that the military occupation was made visible in this particular standoff. Can you talk to us a little bit about religious or cultural constructs of occupation that you have examined in your journalism, in your work?
Oops, I muted. Okay. Yeah, well, so we talk about this being an occupation, right? Or when I talk about it, or when tribal leaders articulate it, or grassroots leaders on the reservation. What is often misunderstood, I think, by the general American public is the concept of nationhood, indigenous nationhood, and its persistence, right? And the fact that it pre-exists the existence of the United States itself, right? And I think that and that was something I really noticed when I was covering Standing Rock, was the way in which our allies, white NGOs and so that they would excise anything having to do with sovereignty from the emails they were sending their supporters, their donors, right? They would basically just make it all about the water and climate change. And even though, when these environmental groups, when they sue, when they go to court, they have a much higher chance of success when they sue with the tribe, because the tribe is coming at it as a different with different legal status than American citizens have. And so they use tribes to win cases. But I did not feel they did a good enough job, educating people about this political status of tribal nations in this country. And in the book I go into a great deal. I focus a lot on what I call algorithms, right? Origin stories as algorithms. And so these origin stories, the origin story of a colonist is very different than the origin story of an indigenous people, right? The origin story of a colonist is based on colonialism, right? Which is basically going to other people's homelands. Like, this isn't the homeland of the United States, right? The homeland. I give this lecture about how the U.S. is still a colony, and I make this point in the book as well. This is not the homeland. The United States homeland is tied to its colonial forebear, which of course is England, right? Not the United States, not here. And so, but the colonist goes to other people's homelands, occupies it, takes the wealth, and exports it back to its ruling class. It's 1%. This is the very definition of a colonist, right? And so the colonial aspect of it, you can basically predict what a colony is going to do based on this kind of model and the implied set of rules this particular origin story entails, right? I think of them as if-then statements, and these if-then statements act like algorithms to create certain outcomes like climate change, right? And or, as I should note, also the constant threat of nuclear winter that hangs over all of us, right? I don't think we think enough about that, but anyway, that's probably because of where I grew up. So when you contrast that to that of an indigenous people, right? And I found a very short definition, which I felt worked. It's my grandmother's cousin, Vine Deloria Jr. He was a Standing Rock Sioux tribal member. He was also a very well-known historian and professor, and he wrote a book called Custer Died for Your Sins, which was subtitled An Indian Manifesto, which was a very, very influential book in the late 60s that really helped inform the Red Power movement in the 1970s. And in the book, I actually sort of contrast my grandmother's family, the Delorias, and their writing to that of the Bundys and their Book of Nay, which is really more of a scrapbook of ideas, kind of taken from the Bible, the Constitution, the Book of Mormon, the Doctrine and Covenants, this sort of thing. But both of these families have ideas about their political situation, and they're trying to use those ideas to accrue power for their people, right? For their interests. And so I thought it was a very good one-to-one sort of thing. And so this book, written by my grandmother's cousin, I saw people reading his books like God is Red at camp, and so it has a deep influence on how Native people, particularly Dakota and Lakota people, view their struggle, because he's a Standing Rock Sioux tribal member. As I mentioned, my great grandmother and her sister, my great aunt Ella Deloria, were raised at Standing Rock. So even though we are Yankton, a lot of what we do and understand was deeply impacted by living on Standing Rock for 40 years in that generation. And so, but the origin story that he gives to a definition he gives to for Indigenous people is, he says a people with a capital P, because often Indigenous people, our name for ourselves is the people. Like for my mother's people, it's Dene, and that means the real people, right? And that's often what Indigenous people call themselves. Dakota or Lakota means allies. It's a little different, but the origin story of an Indigenous people lies in a meeting with a sacred being who is a manifestation of the land itself, right? And so in this meeting, you're given your instructions, you make an agreement with the land, and this agreement is what makes you a people. Once you make the agreement, then you are a people. And I point out that my grandma's cousin, my Lala, he used to say, before we met the white buffalo calf woman, we were not Dakota. After we met her, then we became Dakota. Before that, we were something else, right? So for our people, we met the white buffalo calf woman. She was a manifestation of the Great Plains itself, a spiritual manifestation. And when she came to us, she brought us the pipe, the chompa. And when we pray with it, we reaffirm these agreements that we made. right, with her. And so we made, so we don't come into the land as dominant, as sort of this idea of dominion and this idea of profiteering. We come to this land and we make a relationship, a very real relationship to the land, and this relationship defines us, right? And it has rules. And with the pipe, the stem of the pipe, the original one that she brought had a buffalo calf, the front leg of a bone of a buffalo calf. And so we were making relationships with the other people of the land, in this case, the Buffalo Nation. And and it's not one of taking, it's one of mutual agreement and giving. And so I feel like these sorts implied in this relationship are if-then statements that create different algorithmic, um, you know, um, outcomes. And this is why how indigenous people relate to land is so different than the way that colonists do. And I also point out the name, the Bundy's surname, right? And encoded in that is actually a lot of information about the the historical situation that they were coming out of in England, right? I saw this sign in Clive and Bundy's house where it said, "Remember what the name Bundy means." He had this little sign on his wall there in his living room. And I was like, what does Bundy mean? It's such a strange name. And so I looked it up, and the meaning I found was that Bundy means bound servitude, right? Bound servitude. And this comes from a practice in Anglo-Saxon England, whereby, a peasant would pledge their oath to kind of allegiance to a lord, to a feudal lord, in exchange for land to farm. And so they would give their bond, they become a bondsman. And the surname Bond, like James Bond, has the same origin. So Bundy and Bond. But under Norman rule, when William the Conqueror came with his buddies from Normandy, this changed. When they came in 1066, I was kind of shocked to find out they actually killed off like 90% of the Anglo-Saxon nobility. And they married the 10% that had daughters and stuff, but they changed it. They really changed the system. And then under their rule, this relationship actually became more actual serfdom, right? Where when the Lord inherited the land, they also inherited the Bundys. The Bundys became basically property, right? And so their relationship to land is very different than indigenous people. It's not directly with the spirit of the land. It's mediated by a feudal human being, a feudal lord, who the feudal lord obtains their right to the land from the monarch, and only the monarch has that God-given right to the land, right? And so it's a very different system. And I did a lot of research into a lot of English common law because and I think when I read what Clive and Bundy is talking about particularly, I feel like he's referencing a lot of these ideas about what Anglo-Saxon law was like, right? This idea the sheriff is the most powerful person in the world, this county supremacy ideology that came out of his former attorney, Karen Budd Fallon. I think she had first articulated it in 1993 for a New Mexico sort of sagebrush issue that was going on in the state of New Mexico. And she was his attorney in 1993. She under Trump, she actually became the deputy solicitor of the Bureau of Land Management, which is the agency that she used to sue all the time. Like for 25 years, she would sue actual department employees for basically enforcing governmental regulations. She sued them under RICO, for racketeering, right? And then under Trump, she actually became the deputy solicitor. So it's what came out of Standing Rock and what came out of the Bundy thing is that it did actually become power, actual access to power. With the Bundys, of course, under Trump, the Hammonds were pardoned and released from prison, which the Hammonds were the ranching family that Ammon Bundy had come to stand for in Harney County in Oregon. They were actually, when the father and son, the Hammonds, were released from prison, they were actually met by a billionaire who flew them in his private jet back home. And of course, with Standing Rock, Even though Trump had reversed the decision to stop the pipeline, there were a number of things that came out of that. One was inspiring people who came to the protest to run for office. And one of those was AOC. Right, she is now a congresswoman, a major voice for this, sort of the next generation of leadership in this country. And the other is Deb Haaland, who went to Standing Rock, and she was inspired to run for Congress as well. And she was one of the first 2 Native women to be elected to Congress. And she is now the Secretary of the Interior, overseeing not just like the little part of the BLM, but the entire, most of the public lands in this country.
That's it. It's a relief, isn't it? Such a different Deb Haaland versus Karen Bud Phelan. It's just not the same. It's just not the same. Betsy, these ideas around occupation, religious and cultural constructs. Jackie was telling us quite a bit about political constructs of occupation. What have you uncovered and discovered as you're a historian, you've been looking at the Bundy movement for a while with a religious lens. What can you tell us about the Bundys' religious or cultural or political view of occupation, or do they all kind of combine for them?
Just listening to Jacqueline, I had a couple of things occur to me, and I hope it's okay to sort of jump back and forth a little bit, because I've been taking notes, because she'll say something that I think is really interesting. There are a couple of things. It's interesting, again, this religiously, in order to understand the Bundys, you have to understand that their campaign is religiously inspired. It's something that it's something that God, they believe, is telling them to do. It's something that they believe that they're in communication with God. And Jackie talked about the Nay book. The Nay book, in addition to quotes from religious texts, actually also has a number of revelations. And one of the revelations one of the prophets that they quote with great regularity is Ezra Taft Benson, who talks about religious war, and there might be bloodshed. And so that's why they've become increasingly comfortable, probably, with this kind of militant element. And Jackie, you also talked about something that I think is really interesting, and I'm going to sort of compare and contrast a little bit based on my. I mean, you know so much more about this than I do, so I'm hoping that you find some things to latch onto and maybe even edit or add to. But the Dene talk about the people. I mean, this idea of the people, and the Bundys always reference we the people. And it's interesting to me that they feel like when they talk about we the people, that they're encompassing the views of we the people. I mean, we the people in reference to the Constitution, and yet they are very reticent to understand that we the people actually is much bigger than the Bundy movement. And so when you have different cultures talking about the people, what does that mean? In the case of the Bundys, it really means people who believe what they believe. And again, they've tied that, though, into their particular religious worldview, because they are theo-constitutionalists. When I went and talked to Cliven a year before the takeover of Malheur, he told me that Jesus wrote the Constitution, and that it was an inspired document. And in doing that, it allows for a certain sort of creative interpretation that if the Son of God wrote the Constitution, then as a religious family, they're privy perhaps to understand it better than we do, which is a way that the Constitution is regarded by some Mormon people. And again, the Bundys do not typify Mormonism. They have a very specific way of seeing it. And I also just want to talk a little bit too about colonization and the way that the Mormon people, and again, we're talking about the way colonization happened, and that there was an effort to grab resources and to bring them back into white empire. But there was also a large emphasis on missionizing as a way to indoctrinate people and a way to control people. And certainly Native American cultures understand that very well, very painfully aware of that particular issue and Jacqueline writes about it in her book about her family, some of them practicing Mormonism, and it was an effort in terms of colonization on the part of the Mormon people when they came out west to control the native populations, to bring them into the faith. And one aspect of what Joseph Smith talked about is there was the Lamanites, which he regarded as the native people in this country, and the Nephites, who were two brothers, Nephi and Laman, and they came over and they were part of the lost tribe of Israel, and they settled this country, or rather the Americas, and they fought back and forth. And because the Lamanites, who were the native people, engaged in some transgressions, and I'm using the language of the Mormon tradition, they got dark skin. And, we see this very sort of, layer of Mormonism that's so deeply racist. They weren't the only ones. I mean, this was not just the Mormon people, but there was a belief that if a Lamanite was converted, that their skin would turn white and delightsome. And so this conversion effort, this colonialism, and this missionizing, all was part of the same effort, some part of the same campaign. So in regard to the native people, the Mormons believe that they are in relationship, that they've been part of the same, like, sort of familial trajectory since they settled in the Americas, and that it's incumbent upon the Mormon people to convert native people, and that will also bring about latter days. And so if you have, in terms of colonialism, if you're thinking about it in terms of the Mormon colonialism, it's got that extra layer of indoctrination and sort of really jaw-dropping aspects to it.
It's like an extra load of rocks in there. We've got a couple of questions that have come in that I think really tie into some of the discussion happening right now. So let me jump right in with a question from Nicole Walker. She says, religion and law are very messily tied up here. Can you talk more about how the law was differently applied to the Bundys compared to the way it was applied or misapplied to the people at Standing Rock? I think there's a lot in this question about what is law and whose laws are we talking about. Jacqueline, do you want to take a first jump in at this?
Yeah, so I mentioned that treaties are the supreme law of the land under the Constitution, which of course the Bundys worship, right? And they're also international law, right? Only sovereign nations can enter into treaties, right? Sometimes I feel like, and I mentioned this in the book, that a lot of times I feel like many Americans think that treaties were sort of a way in which tribes politically extinguished themselves, right? And actually under international law, treaties cannot be used that way. They cannot be. They're an exercise of sovereignty. They're not a way of extinguishing sovereignty, right? And many of these treaties didn't give away any land at all. I mean, the treaties, particularly in Nevada, I don't think that any of them gave away land. I think that the Shoshone one was just to allow passage of Oregon Trail people. So I saw a map one time which showed like how much of the land in the United States there is no treaty to hand it over, right? It's just basically held through military occupation, right? And so, but with I think that when we look at the legal sort of validity of each group, the Bundys, and their ideas about public lands and the commons and all these things, there is really no legal basis for what they're pushing. And Clive and Bundy has been told this repeatedly since the early 90s, in court case after court case, judge after judge has told them, like, they have this idea that the U.S. government can only own like 10 acres square of land and maybe needful places like military bases, and can't really own, all this public land it shouldn't be. But that's just not true. And in the case of the state of Nevada, where Cliven lives, the state actually entered the Union, basically giving up all rights to public lands, because it was the state that came to sort of right around the Civil War. It was this sort of anyway. So it was a free state that came in, and they wanted they didn't want the slaveholding states didn't want it to have anyway. This was the agreement they had to make to get into the Union. So in 2016, as I noted actually in a previous book that I wrote for Tory House called Edge of Morning about Bears Ears, it was part of the platform of the Republican Party, not just these Republican state legislatures, but like Utah, but it was the national platform of the Republican Party to give back public lands to the states, so the states could then sell them and privatize them, right? And I should note that at the Malheur Wildlife Refuge, it had been private land at one point. Bundy land, Ammon Bundy land. I'm going to get the miners back to mining, the loggers back to logging, the ranchers back to ranching. The speech he gave, and in fact, when insinuating that this wildlife refuge, which actually was being run under a management compact agreed upon by the ranchers, the tribe, and the Fish and Wildlife Service and organizations like the Audubon Society. They worked on this compact for a decade, and they're very happy with it. It was considered the gold standard of this sort of collaboration between these different parties, and but the wildlife refuge had been private land, and this was a cattle baron came in the 19th century, late 19th century, and basically purchased everything. And the ranchers there were actually squatters at that point. They were reduced to squatting on getting the access to the wildlife refuge, and they actually murdered the manager of this cattle ranch, this cattle baron, and his name was John French. French Glen there in Oregon is named after him there in Harney County, and they murdered him. And then they basically held a kangaroo trial and absolved themselves of his murder. Right. So what the Bundys fix is, which is privatization, doesn't necessarily go the way they want it to go. I mean, it can be a situation that would deprive them further. They may not be the winners in this. Right. So and I would say that, as much as they're using religious ideas to push their buttons or whatever, I think that it's always in use of political power and personal gain. I mean, they know on some level what they're doing. And I also point out that I believe that the difference in the way they are being treated, part of it is that they were referencing Ruby Ridge and Waco, right? So they were sort of daring the federal agents to create another Ruby Ridge or Waco, and in a sense, holding themselves hostage, right? I mean, and so it's kind of a strange idea, but so as a way to gain political power, right? You create these conflicts, you come out of them, and but one of the things I also want to reference as far as all of this is the issue of the Doctrine of Discovery, right? In the Doctrine of Discovery, which was a legal sort of idea articulated by one of the first Chief Justices of the United States Supreme Court, John Marshall. And John Marshall is famous for 3 cases that he did, which are foundational to Indian federal law. And in one case, these were like these were decisions that came down in the late 1820s to mid 1830s, and in one of these cases, he had to decide. There were two American landowners, farmers, who had title to the same land, right? And one had gotten title from the state, and one had gotten title from the tribe, right? And he had to decide whose title was more, valid. And so, this was a brand new country. It didn't have a lot of case law for him to go back on. So he would sort of draw upon legal traditions all over the world, not just English common law. And he actually he hit upon these papal bulls that were from the Vatican, and they were from 1491 and 1550. Two different popes had come up with these bulls. And often, the Pope would be called upon to sort of adjudicate fights between sovereigns in Europe, right? And this was between Portugal and Spain over, who had the right to certain colonies. And part of this decisions, these papal bulls also gave, is why Brazil speaks Portuguese, because they did a longitudinal line to divide the spoils. And but what the popes were saying was that this doctrine of discovery, basically, as it was termed by Marshall, what basically said that that only discovering Christian European countries, countries subject to the Pope, right, had the fee simple title to the land. So once they landed and they put down their flag, and they usually landed at the mouth of a river and claimed the entire watershed, right? They put their flag, they read their little statement, they nail something on a tree, and the title, the actual title to the fee simple title, then reverts to the crown, to the monarch of that country, right? Automatically. And so this is still active law in the United States. This is the basis of title in this country, right? And we were talking about Rick Santorum and his there's whole thing of calling this a Christian country. Well, technically, unless the U.S. is a Christian country, they don't qualify, to have title under the Doctrine of Discovery, which requires that it be a Christian country, right? And Chief Justice Marshall was, of course, the United States did not exist when these papal bulls were issued, right, in the 15th century, but he stated that the United States inherited that status as a discovering country, Christian country, because it is a colony of England, which did exist at that time and was subject to the Pope at that time, right? And so this is the very basis of title in this country. It's still the legal basis. In fact, it was recently cited as 2005 in the case of the city sheriff of New York versus the Oneida Nation of New York. And in that case, the city of Sherrill had signed a lease for its land with the Oneida Nation in the late 19th century, a 99-year lease. And they would go and do this big ceremony, give a couple dollar bills to the Indians and go, thank you, for this land. And then they didn't expect the tribe to still be around in the 1990s, 100 years later. And when they were like, oh my God, we have to renegotiate this lease. And it clouded the title to all the homeowners and businesses in the city of Sherrill, right? And so they took it to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the city of Sherrill, New York, saying that the Oneida Nation, because it is not Christian, discovering all this stuff, European, it could not have title, right? And the justice that wrote that decision was Ruth Bader Ginsburg. She cited the Doctrine of Discovery. So I think often Americans don't understand the actual legal situation they're in, and just how incredibly unethical it is. Because basically what the Doctrine of Discovery says is that the only title that indigenous people have is that of animals, of occupation and use, right? And so, this is basically saying that we are not fully human. And really, we may have disagreements with other countries like, Pakistan or Iran or something, but, we don't dispute their title. Really, but indigenous nations, our title has been legally abrogated by this law and is still active law in this country. So yeah,
it's religion and law going back so deep here, drawing on that papal bull. Betsy, in your studies of the Bundys, do you have anything you want to add in there about how religion and law get kind of tied up and how the Bundys experienced law enforcement as a result of of this kind of messy relationship?
Well, law enforcement for sure. I mean, I think that we can all agree that law enforcement was deferential to white men with guns. The other thing that I just had a couple of thoughts, because when I hear Jackie speak, I think, okay, I have something
I
that I'd love
know.
to hear her respond to. But there are a couple of things. Number one, she talked about the fact that they cite this idea over and over again that the government can't own land, bigger than 10 acres, and the 10th Amendment. And that goes in front of the federal courts probably once every 25 years, and it's completely thrown out every single time. The government can own public land. They can have federal land, but it also goes back, and they are big adherents to Cleon Skousen, which we don't have time to get into him, but he is a pseudo historian and a John Bircher, and very, very close to Ezra Taft Benson, had a controversial relationship with the church in the sense that part of them loved him, part of them did not. He was very big. He wrote a book called The Naked Communist. And when I met his son, he told me that, McCarthy was right. I mean, it was his nephew. And, so he was a supporter of McCarthyism. He wrote a book called The 5,000-Year Leap. I think I'm getting that right. Where he talked about various, again, he's a pseudo historian, and he talked about the fact that the government can't own land. And so they're hearing him. He's a very compelling member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and has been very inspirational to the Bundys and their movement, and also to Glenn Beck, who converted to Mormonism. And then the other thing, and again, I hope this is sort of answering your question, Nicole. When I talked to the Bundys, and they were trying to justify, it wasn't as much religion in terms of backing up their legal understanding, but maybe heritage. And to understand Mormon settlement is to understand that that's a sacred story, that the Mormons coming to the Great Basin and settling in a place that was overlooked by other white people, although inhabited by Native people, became a sort of a story with religious connotations about Mormon fortitude. And so when I talked to Cliven, and he said, he was trying to tell me about his particular ownership connection to the land. He said, in the first Mormon settlement, he used a hypothetical ancestor, and it was Nephi Johnson. And I don't have a time to get into it. I write about Nephi Johnson, who was Cliven's spiritual great grandfather. But he said, when this ancestor came and that horse drank out of the Virgin River, and he created a beneficial use of that river. So somehow the Mormon settlers' horse drinking out of the river created a beneficial use, whereas the day before, the Southern Paiute getting a drink of water, or swimming in the river, or whatever, collecting reeds near the river, that somehow was not as important in establishing ownership as a Mormon horse drinking out of that river. So when you're talking about these legal understandings, they're connected to ancestry, and they're connected to an understanding of history that begins with Mormon settlement.
Wow.
Kind of self-serving.
Yeah, kind of self-serving. Linda Young asks, what would spark an armed rebellion in the West? She says, after reading American Zion, I felt like a subgroup of Mormons were aching to shoot those who don't share the beliefs, given the opportunity or provocation. So she's wondering what exactly might spark an armed rebellion in the West. Betsy, do you want to jump on that one? Because I know you've been following the Ammon Bundy militia folks around their good times in Idaho of late.
Well, what I've noticed is that this idea of liberty is now, gun rights has been conflated with masks, which has been conflated with vaccines, which has been conflated with grazing on public lands. And so we have a group of people as motivated by the Bundys, Ammon, who are looking for the next thing. And I called Ammon in March of last year, saying, okay, this has all the makings for an next rebellion. And he said, yeah, under these kind of conditions, the government uses this opportunity to consolidate power. And so he was looking at this as the shutdowns, the COVID protocols, Governor Little, who's the governor of Idaho, putting these things in place very early because there was such a big outbreak in Sun Valley. And so the short answer, because I know we're running out of time and I want to hear from Jackie too, is it could be about anything right now. It could be about, a vaccine mandate in schools. It could be about a continued mask mandate. If there's still hot spots of outbreaks, it could be about Deb Haaland and the Department of Interior and the BLM deciding that they finally want to enforce regulations on public lands and demand that they adhere to the cow-calf pair, essentially limits on how many cows and calves you can put on your allotment. There are a number of people right now that are really aching to rebel if the BLM enforces the rules, because under Trump, and even to be fair, under Obama, these rules have not been properly enforced. And Jackie probably has some amazing insights too.
Yeah, well, I think that I think what we saw at the Capitol in the insurrection on January 6th, and I should note that here in Oregon, in Salem, our Capitol building was, invaded by a group of, right-wing folks, and probably the same folks that supported the Bundys here in Malheur, and it's and we've been having problems actually with getting the Republican. It's a Democratic state, so the legislature and everything is controlled by the Democrats. But the Republicans have been basically doing these walkouts. I think about a year and a half ago, they actually kind of ran off to Idaho. They were trying to, because they were going to send the state troopers after them to make them come and make a quorum so they could do the voting. This last legislative session, they were making everything be read aloud, and they were slowing down the process of passing laws. And so it's getting pretty crazy, and then today we saw, of course, Liz Cheney being booted out of her position of leadership in the Republican Party in Congress, and because she would not accept the idea that the election was stolen, because she was challenging it and challenging Trump. And so even though Trump has been deplatformed from Twitter and Facebook for the time being, he still has incredible amounts of power. And this is where the storytelling comes in, this thing where you could tell stories that get people really riled up and get them moving. And so that is still quite a danger that's going on. I don't see that stopping. And, Betsy's right. I do worry about Deb Haaland. I mean, I don't want to say that even out loud, because I don't want to, I don't know. It's almost like afraid to talk about it because you don't want, but under Trump, BLM offices were brought to a more local level. And, official governmental employees were made to leave Washington, D.C. And the idea is to get them on the ground in these communities where they can be harassed, right? And sort of bullied into not enforcing regulations, where local people can take over the positions. And when I was interviewing folks at the Fish and Wildlife Service in Malheur, they were telling me that they all were hidden. During the takeover, they had to go into sort of be placed in sort of secret places, and their whole families. And they was unsafe to even drive a truck that had the Fish and Wildlife Service logo on it, right? And the sort of intimidation, and talking to folks who work in the Forest Service here in Oregon, they were telling me that if people from the communities work in these positions, they don't enforce regulations, right? And so so it's quite it's very interesting. In my book, I also go into a lot about county governments, because I see a lot of this happening at the county level, right? And when you look at the way the early Mormon church settled the land, they were looking out to try to maintain political control. So, when you look at how they sent people out to go kind of hoard the water sources, right? Establish communities where they could control the water, or where they, in Bears Ears, I go through a lot of detail and how they basically ordered settlers to go to sell everything and go move to San Juan County, right? In order to, to keep control of that area. They were looking at a territory to control, right? And so it's not like your traditional way you think of pioneerism, where people kind of go where they want to go and go after some idea of where they think they'll do better, they'll get land. This was more of a state organized sort of Soviet style of like, you go here, you do this, and it's all to benefit the church. It's very controlled. And so so that is I don't know if I answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's great. Jessica, do we have time for one more terrific question?
Sure, if our lovely panelists are willing to sit through it. I've got one in the Q&A and one in the chat.
There's there's one I kind of wanted to get to. Maybe we can get to both. One from I believe David Meyer, who says, each of you has explained a spiritual or religious connection that a group of people, indigenous or Mormon, believes it has with the land, sometimes even the same land. Doesn't any adjudication of conflicting claims in such a case implicitly discount these spiritual or religious beliefs of one group and thereby of both? So that this question, does any adjudication of conflicting claims, since it's going to side with one, is there some sense that it discounts the spiritual and religious beliefs really of both?
Well, I'd like to say that I've been doing more research. I think I mentioned to both Kirsten and Betsy that I've been doing more research on the founding of the Mormon Church, where the ideas came from. I mean, and in my book Standoff, I sort of approached it with the idea that this came out of the Second Great Awakening. When people were in the upstate New York, and it was the burned over region where there was this kind of this furor in the over religion that was occurring. A number of religions grew out of that time period. I also have the theory that basically going to a place where there was obviously had been continued occupation and civilization for 1,000 years. I mean, the New York State was basically the Iroquois Confederacy before the Revolutionary War, and I make a case in the book that this is actually why the Revolutionary War was fought, to gain access to Indian land. Right, King George III had issued the Proclamation Line of 1763 and told the colonists they could not cross it. Right, which is basically along the Appalachian Mountains, and so they wanted that land. They wanted to get to the Ohio Valley and what they called the Northwest Territories at the time, and which is basically the eastern Great Lakes area. And so they, but confronted and living in this place and seeing all around them, examples of a civilization not accounted for in the Bible. I mean, that it basically challenged their very cosmological concept of the world and challenged God in a way. So they had to create a way to insert that world here, right? And once again, the relationship is not with the land, right? With an indigenous people, the relationship is directly with the land, with the spirit of the land itself, right? With this case, it's with a religious idea that had been brought to them through colonization in Europe, right? This stuff that it was brought to them by the Roman Empire. The church, the Catholic Church, was the religion of empire. And the religion of empire and the emperor, the imperator, is a very different thing than the religion where the spiritual relationship to the actual land itself. Those are different things, right? They're not the same. And so this imposition of the colonization of Europe, and then trying to bring that here, that is a totally different thing. So.
Yeah, and I'm not sure. I mean, that question is so interesting, and of course,
Yeah.
I have my own opinion, but I want to be, I want to answer it from the perspective of a historian, or I see. Oh gosh, it's so tricky. I mean, I think that in this day and age, we have to rethink religious beliefs that are colonial, that are missionizing, that are, and I even would say, there's an emphasis, and again, this doesn't represent, there are a number of Mormon, sort of younger Mormons in Salt Lake City now that have gotten involved in climate issues and are trying to be more preservationist oriented, conservationist oriented. But it's not really something that the church has wholeheartedly embraced. And as we have these ways of perceiving land, for example, Joseph Smith talked about land, building land to be to delight the eye of God, that there wasn't an emphasis on land not being utilized, that to utilize land in the Mormon tradition was to thereby make it sacred. And so when we're considering land use at this point, and we see a religious or a religious culture that calls for, as Jackie said, mining, logging, and grazing, which is what the Bundys were talking about reinstating at Malheur. I think that we're running counter to what we need to do as a society. And so, in terms of ways of seeing things, I think that there needs to be in our culture, as we the people in like big tent, a way to review colonialist and Christian ideas and Mormon ideas. And I know, Mormons consider themselves Christian, but Jackie did mention this idea of dominion, which is extremely destructive to the way that we perceive landscape. And if you go and see the Bundys speak, they will talk about dominion. I've seen them talk about it at a number of rallies, and it's something that they use to substantiate their position, and the fact that humans are in charge and other species are somewhat either they're irrelevant or they take a big back seat. And so I do think it's important to look at indigenous knowledge, indigenous traditions, and to reconsider the way that we've set up these ways of managing land that do come out of a Judeo-Christian sort of worldview, and to ask to rather challenge the Mormon Church and to say, you really have emphasized built landscape, utilized landscape as sacred space rather than landscape that is habitat or landscape that is indigenous land. Brigham Young did finally begrudgingly recognize the fact that they were colonizing indigenous land. And he sort of, acknowledged it and said, we should be nice to indigenous people. But it's time for us, based on what we know of these cultural perspectives, to really reassess. And I think that's why Bears Ears is such a fabulous story, because I do think that there has been true reassessment. And in any case, I hope that kind of answers your question, because I know what you're asking and I think it's fascinating.
Yeah.
And I kind of just gave you a messy answer, but it was heartfelt.
Well, that's one of the things that's been so wonderful about these questions is they really spark a lot of thinking and a lot of discussion that
I think you gave a great answer, Betsy.
Yeah.
And maybe that answer might lead us to our last question. John asks, the presentation leads me to think our spiritual and religious beliefs are the root of most of the conflict in the world today. How do we transcend this?
Well, I would say, yeah, I would say that, we have to look at what these religious ideas are meant to, where they come from and what they're meant to accomplish, right? Like if we look at a lot of how Christianity was introduced to Europe, it was introduced through military force, right? And it was meant to represent the power of empire, right? And the way it was brought here too for indigenous people. And so, when you see how it operates, and I would say the way that the Bundys are using it is almost an instinctual grab for power, a way of utilizing the ideas they have on hand and the Book of Nay to kind of craft sort of a way to obtain power, to leverage power. And so I would say the issue is not necessarily spiritual. That is just it's a way in which people can, it's the way it's being utilized that is the problem, right? I think that I contrast this with what happened at Standing Rock and with, the writing. I see my book, Standoff, to be sort of the third book in my family on the same topic, right? The first one being my great aunt Ella's book, my great great aunt Ella Deloria's book, Speaking of Indians, which came out in 1944. Which looked at the results of the Indian Reorganization Act and the challenges facing tribes to particularly Dakota and Lakota people to hang on to their culture. She was an ethnologist and was she created this huge dictionary of the Dakota and Lakota language. And then of her nephew, of my grandma's cousin, Vine Delora Jr., and his book, Custer Died for Your Sins, which came out in 1969 following the Civil Rights Movement, where he had been the executive director of the National Congress of American Indians in DC. So there are, and then what we are looking at is how do we use ideas to basically, as I said, how do we live together? I think this is the goal of indigenous peoples. How do we maintain a structure that allows us to live together in peace? And when you look at Bears Ears in particular, you see that there are 5 tribes that have claims to that same place, but they have been able to do it in a way in which they're not conflicting with each other. And the monument proposal itself was done entirely through consensus between representatives of all 5 tribes. So there are things to be learned from indigenous cultures that can help with this process. And so
So wonderful. Well, it's been a joy for me to be a part of this conversation. Jacqueline and Betsy, always just a total joy to revisit your work. I always learn something. And Jessica, thank you for hosting us all.
Again, I just dropped the link to purchase Standoff from Jacqueline Keeler or American Zion from Betsy Gaines Quammen into the chat. I was trying to get the last 2 books that Jacqueline just mentioned in there as well. So do be sure to check those out as well. We also have Edge of the Morning, which was Jacqueline's previous book, which is very near and dear to my heart. And thank you all so much for joining us this evening. This is truly fascinating, and I can't wait for the next big ideas that come from both of you. So thank you so much for sharing those with us.
Jessica, thank you so much for having us. Kirsten, thank you so much for moderating. Jackie, thank you so much for the most amazing book that I love talking to you, and I learned so much from this book, and I really, really appreciate it. And thank you everybody who's joined us. Your questions have been amazing, and just really grateful. I mean, it's a beautiful evening in Bozeman, and you could have been out, walking on Pete's Hill, and you joined us here. So thank you so much. And yay, Country Bookshelf.
Yay, Country Bookshelf. Everybody buy books at Country Bookshelf.
yes.
And if you don't have plans to go walking on Pete's Hill tomorrow, you can check us out. Our Books in Common series is welcoming Chloe Davis and her book, The Queen's English, which is a etymological look at the contributions of the LGBTQIA+ community to the English language. So we're gonna have trivia. It's gonna be great. So if there are any word nerds hanging out with us tonight, please join us tomorrow. You can find registration information on bookshelf.com.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Have a great night.
All right.
You too.